Greetings everyone, Arcimedes here, and it's good to be back. So, I first of all want to just make a quick apology that I haven't been around for the videos in between June through August. Some stuff exploded, and thusly, no LEGO videos. However, finally, today, I present to you my next video. So, for today, we're going to be talking about gears. Instead of talking about gears in a very super practical sense, what you were to do with them, all the different classes of them, etc., today we're going to be talking about something a little more basic. Today, we're going to be talking about the physics, the basic concepts, and the basic workings of gears. Then, when you're done with all this fabulous knowledge in your head, you'll be able to approach them much more fully, understanding how they work. And so, without further ado, let's get started. Now, before you see the lovely gear, the LEGO gear in particular. Now, I'm sure you pretty much know some basics about these gear, but nonetheless, I just want to go over a little bit of basic terminology. First and foremost, a gear is simply a wheel that has teeth attached to it. The teeth are these individual nubs on the face of the gear. Now, a gear's size, at least in LEGO, is measured by the number of teeth. So this here, for example, is a 40-tooth gear, while this one is a 24-tooth. The more teeth, usually, the larger the circumference of the circle, and the larger gear overall. So thus, if there's more teeth in a gear, it's a bigger gear. Before you see the LEGO gear. Now, I'm pretty sure you kind of have a basic idea of what these things are. I mean, after all, they're gears. They're these things with teeth on them. Well, don't. Before I present to you the gear. Now, I'm sure you probably already have a pretty good idea of what a gear is, but nonetheless, let's just go over some basic terminology. Now, a gear is a wheel with teeth attached to it. And those are these little nubs running along the side of the gear. These teeth mesh together to rotate the two gears. Now, these teeth in LEGO, gears are measured by the number of teeth they have. This here, for example, is a 40-tooth gear, while this is a 24-tooth gear. All LEGO gear teeth are the same size, approximately. So technically, you can mesh pretty much any Technic gear with any other Technic gear. However, sometimes the sizes don't work out properly, but that's a story for some geometry and another day. Today, we're just going to be talking about the basics of gears and how they work. So, let's start off on this wonderful adventure. However, before we get any further, I'd like you to stand up. Without getting any further, let me introduce you to the Technic gear. Now, there are a whole bunch of these in a whole bunch of different sizes, but they are all fairly basic in design. The gears you see before you are straight-tooth gears. Now, all gears are practically just a wheel with teeth, the little nubs around the edge, attached to them. LEGO calculates the sizes of these gears by the number of teeth they have. This gear, in my fingers right now, is a 40-tooth gear, which is practically the largest LEGO gear that they create. And this gear here is a 24-tooth gear. So the more teeth you have, the larger the gear is, since all LEGO gear teeth are the same size. Now, as I just said, all LEGO gears teeth are the same size, with a few exceptions, but we're not going to get into them. Most LEGO gears teeth are the same size. All Technic gears have the same size teeth. That means, technically, they can all mesh with one another. Now, in practical circumstances, it doesn't always work that way, but we're going to assume that for these purposes right now. Now, as you can see, gears mesh together like this. Their teeth fit together. Each tooth pushes the next tooth, which pushes the next tooth, rotating the gears around. Now, as you can see, when two gears are meshed together right next to one another, if this gear here is spinning clockwise, any gear meshed with it would be spinning counterclockwise. So as you can see, clockwise, counterclockwise. They spin in opposite directions. Now for a little more terminology. What you see before you in your hands is a gear train. A gear train is any set of gears that are meshing together. So for example, we have a gear train of 3 gears in my hands right now. 2 24-tooth and 1 8-tooth. In a gear train, the gear that is being provided power is called the driver gear, or the input gear. So in this case, it's the one to the left because that's the one I'm rotating. Now, the gear on the end, the gear receiving the output energy, so the output gear, can be called the driven gear. So the gear that is input is the driver gear, and the gear that is output is the driven gear. So, in a 2-gear train, as you see before you right here, this is very simple. Input, output, driver, driven. But how about these cute little gears in the middle? In a lot of cases, gear trains will have more than just 2 gears, unlike the example we just saw before. Now here, in this gear train, these middle 2 follower gears, the gears that are not input or output, are called idler gears, since they really don't do anything to the gear train overall. They just kind of sit there to take up space and bring the gear train from one point to another. Now, as we just said before, whenever there are 2 gears meshing and next to one another, when 2 gears are adjacent, they spin in opposite directions. As you can see, this one is spinning counterclockwise, and this gear is spinning clockwise. Pretty simple, right? Now, let's drop a gear in between these 2 gears. As you can see now, the 2 end gears, whereas before they were spinning in opposite directions, are now spinning in the same direction, and the gear in the center is spinning opposite. Anytime there is a gear in between 2 other gears, the 2 gears on the ends will maintain spinning in the same direction, whereas the gears adjacent, as we already said before, will be spinning in opposite directions. One way of thinking about this is that whenever there's an odd number of gears, the first gear and the last gear will spin in the same direction. But when there's an even number of gears, the gears on the ends spin in opposite directions. Make some sort of sense? What my advice is, go and play with this. Mesh some gears together. Figure it out yourself. So, now that we've talked about the basics and terminology of gears, now let's get into the reasons why we use gears at all. Now, in short, gears can be used for 2 basic purposes. One of them is to transfer angular velocity, rotational motion, from one place to another. So as you can see here, if I put a motor on this gear right here, and put my output on this gear here, I would be able to have my power source a long way away from the source, the output of the power. However, more importantly, as well as just taking up space and transferring motion, gears can also increase speed and torque. Hold up just a second, Arci, you say. Just what are speed and torque? Well, I hope to do a further, more complicated explanation of them in the future, but for now, let's just put it in a simple way of saying that speed is, well, frankly, you know what speed is. If something is speedier, it's faster, right? It moves faster, it spins faster, what have you. And if something has greater torque, it has more power. So, for example, if we compared a sports car and a pickup truck, the sports car would have greater speed, but the pickup truck would have greater torque, more pulling power. One final note on speed and torque. The more speed you have, the less torque you have. So if you have more speed, you'll have proportionally less torque, and if you have more torque, you'll have proportionally less speed. That's why you won't see a race car being beaten by a pickup truck on a normal raceway, and why you won't see a NASCAR trying to pull a trailer with horses in it. So, you say, just how do gears increase torque and speed? Well, if you look at these two gears meshing together like this, these two 24-tooth gears, you'll see that they spin at exactly the same rate. The input here on the yellow side is exactly the same as the speed of the output on the other side, right? Now that's great and all. If you have two of the same gear, they will spin at exactly the same speed. However, let's take two different sizes of gears. Now, here as you can see, we have two gears of very different size meshing together. An 8-tooth gear on the yellow side, and a 40-tooth gear on the blue side. Now, if you'll watch what happens here, you'll see that it will take 5 times of the 8-tooth gear rotating around before the blue gear, the 40-tooth gear, goes all the way around. Don't believe me? Count for yourself. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So as you can see, when the blue gear, the 40-tooth gear, makes 1 rotation, the 8-tooth gear makes 5 rotations. Now watch this real time. If I spin this at a decent speed, you can see that while I'm only rotating this blue gear, I don't know, probably about a rotation every 5 seconds, the yellow gear is rotating much faster, probably like 25 rotations every 5 seconds. So, as you can see, when you rotate gears and a bigger gear is driving a little gear, when a bigger gear is the drive gear and the end gear in a drivetrain is a smaller gear, you can see that this creates an increase in speed from your initial rotation. If you flip this around, you can see that now when the 8-tooth gear is the drive gear, you can see that it's rotating much slower. Once again, we've got about a rotation every 2-3 seconds, while this big 40-tooth gear makes a rotation probably about every 10-15 seconds. Once again, so now here, as you can see, it's much slower. You could use this gear probably at this current speed to pick up a can or a medium-sized Lego car, while the little gear, this really fast speed, would be incapable of doing it. So, when a smaller gear is the drive gear and a larger gear is the driven gear, input is small, output is large, you get an increase of torque. When the input is large and the output is small, driver driven, then you get an increase in speed. Does that make sense? Play around with this for yourself. See if you can make some experiments. Test it a little bit. See what you think. But how exactly does this work out mathematically? Now, there's an actual formula for finding the ratio of two gears. That's what they call it. Now, first of all, let's make some observations, though. As you can see, when we rotated this big gear around 1 full time, the smaller gear rotates around 5 times. Now, if you were to say this in the terms that most people when working with gears would use, we would call this a 5-to-1 gear ratio. Does that make sense? Every 5 rotations of this little gear are caused by 1 rotation of the big gear. Now, let's test this out with a different gear train. Now here, as you can see, we have an 8-tooth gear meshing with a 24-tooth gear. Now, once again, let's count and see how many rotations it takes the yellow gear to make before the blue gear makes a full rotation. This time, it'll be 1, 2, and 3 before the blue gear makes a full rotation. So, since it takes the yellow gear 3 rotations before the blue gear makes 1 rotation, because it takes the 8-tooth gear 3 rotations before the 24-tooth gear makes 1 rotation, we call this, once again, a 3-to-1 ratio. Is this still making some sort of sense? Now, if you look at this closely, you'll see why. First, let me ask you a very simple math question. What is 24 divided by 8? If you thought 3, you'd be correct. So, 24 divided by 8 equals 3, right? Because 3 times 8 equals 24. So, what a gear ratio really is a fraction that would be representative of the division problem we just did there. We said that it was 24 divided by 8, which is 3. So, the gear ratio is 3/1. Hopefully you all remember that a fraction is actually just another way of showing a division problem, right? Ratio, rational, all that jazz. If you want to find the gear ratio between any set of gears ever, the first step you have is to find the number of teeth of the input gear and the output gear. Once you have that, all you have to do is place the number of teeth of the drive gear, so in this case, that's the 24-tooth gear, and place that in the numerator of the fraction, that's up here, and you place the number of teeth of the driven gear, the output gear, in the denominator. So that would be a fraction, that would be 24/8. Then, all you have to do is reduce that fraction to give you the proper ratio. 24/8 reduces down to 3/1, right? Now, something to be cautious with. Once you've found this lovely number, so in this case, as always remember, input over output, 24/8, and reduce that. After you've done that, you have one more and slightly annoying important step. In the final gear ratio, the number in the numerator becomes the number of rotations that the driven gear makes. And the number in the denominator is the number of the number of rotations that the drive gear makes. So it kind of makes a switch. Whereas before, the value for the drive gear is put in the denominator, when you finally reduce the fraction and create it to make a gear ratio, in the final answer, the way you read that, the number of rotations that the driven gear must make is in the numerator, and the number of rotations that the drive gear makes in the denominator. Why they make it so complicated, I have no idea. I'm just the messenger. I tell you what I know. Final quiz question to prove your knowledge. Here we have a 40-tooth gear and a 24-tooth gear meshing. The 40-tooth gear is the drive gear, and the 24-tooth gear is the driven gear. Can you make the proper gear ratio and tell me which is which? If you figured out that it's 5 rotations of the driven gear to 3 rotations of the drive gear, you're correct. One other important point to make in the topic of gear ratios. In a gear train with more than 2 gears, the only gear ratio you need to know is the ratio in between the input gear and the output gear, the gears on the ends. The values of the ratios in between the idler gears do not matter whatsoever. So in this gear train, as we had just figured out before, it's a 5-to-3 gear train ratio. Now, if you don't believe me, you can test it out for yourself. You can find the ratio in between these 2 gears, the ratio in between these 2 gears, and the ratio in between these 2 gears, and you will find that it is indeed 5/3 if we assume that the drive gear is the 40-tooth gear. Today, we took a look at the very basics and fundamentals of gears. We took a look at terminology and discovered that a gear is nothing more than a wheel with teeth on it. We discovered that Lego names its gears by the number of teeth it has. We also learned that any set of gears meshing together are called a gear train, and that the gear that is being given power, the input gear, is called the driver, and the gear that is taking the power and using it, the output gear, is the driven gear. All gears in the middle of the gear train are called idler gears. Next, we noted that all gears adjacent to one another and meshing spin in opposite directions, as you can see here. In any gear train that has an even number of gears, the input gear and the output gear, the ones on the ends, will spin in opposite directions, while if there's an odd number of gears, the input and the output will spin in the same direction. Next, we talked about gear ratios and how they can improve speed and torque. Larger gear as the drive gear than there is as the driven gear, there is an increase in speed, whereas when the drive gear is smaller than the driven gear, there's an increase in torque. Torque, once again, as we learned, means power or strength to pull and lift. Finally, we took a look at a simple way of finding gear ratios, this wonderful little fraction. All you have to do is place the number of teeth of the drive gear in the numerator and the number of teeth of the driven gear in the denominator, reduce the fraction, and create a nice little simple ratio. The number on the top will represent the number of rotations that the driven gear will make per 1 rotation of the drive gear. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you liked this video. I hope that it was interesting or informative, or at least that it entertained you for a little while. If you did in fact like this video, please comment, rate, and subscribe. If you didn't like this video, still, please comment and rate, and if you really want, still, please subscribe too. I'd like to hear what you have to say would make my videos and my channel different and better. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I bid you all farewell. My name is Arcimedes36, and I'll see you next time.